So as I said, welcome everyone to today's Earthsoft Office Hour. Today we'll be discussing the Analytical Results 2 report enhancements. There's quite a bit of content that we could talk about with this. I'll do my best to keep it brief. And because of that, I might not be able to talk about every single item that's going on in this session, or that's available rather in all of the features, but that's all right. Hopefully we'll be able to at least scrape the surface, and you'll get an opportunity to see some of the neat features that are available. So in terms of the agenda, we're going to talk about some of the hidden parameters. There are some parameters that are available in the Analytical Results 2 report that are hidden by default. We'll also talk about some alternate date formats that are available to you in the tabular report once the report is run, sort of sneaky trick that some folks might not be aware of. We'll talk about extra selects, which I think is my favorite feature of the Analytical Results 2 report. And then we'll touch a little bit on additional fields. As I mentioned before, we're not going to even be able to really dive deep into any of this because there's quite a bit that can be done. So first I want to give you a little bit of background information on that Analytical Results 2 report. So the Analytical Results 2 report is part of the full EQuIS report library, which means that in order to have it available to you, you need to make sure that you've installed the full EQuIS report library. Additionally, it is a class report, which means that it is associated with an actual DLL file, which is why you have to include that full report installation. And so if you want to add any of those additional enhancements, you need to make sure that the report is published, meaning you've taken all of the information that's in that assembly in the DLL file and then basically saved it to the EQuIS database so that it's available within the database assembly. So there is a couple of pieces to know in terms of the place that the reports end up being saved. The first is that when you publish a report, that information ends up being stored in streport and streport parameter. And that is an important distinction between where our base reports or our standard EQuIS reports are saved, and then where our saved PIC reports or user reports are saved. PIC report is the old terminology. Of course, we call those user reports now. And so those user reports are handily stored in that stuser report and stuser report parameter pair of tables. So the reason I like to mention that is if you have saved some user reports based on a particular published DLL, and then you make a change to that DLL, for the most part, the saved user reports should function the same, as long as the changes that are made to that published report don't include some update of a particular process or something like that. Maybe we have enhanced the report somehow. Additionally, you might need to go through and update some of those user reports. However, that's pretty unusual. It doesn't happen every single release, and we'll definitely let you know if that's something that would come up. So the first thing that we're going to take a look at here, in a second, I'm going to turn off my webcam so you can just see the screen and not look at my face any longer. But the first thing that we're going to look at here is the report publisher. And the report publisher is a nice user interface that allows you to take a look at all of the parameters for the particular report. And that allows you to review what is existing in the database, what is coming in from the particular report, and decide which pieces you want to keep and which ones you want to jettison. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and stop sharing that webcam. All right, so in terms of what we're looking at here, this is EQuIS Professional. I already have it open with a couple of the tables and the reports that I want to look at here in a bit. But in order to access that report publisher, there's that nice Publish Reports button in our home ribbon. Of course, this is in EQuIS Professional version 6.6.1. So when I click on that Reports button, I get a pop-up window telling me, what report did you want to publish? This is going to point directly to our EQuIS report library folder, which is going to be in our program files Earthsoft EQuIS file tree. So I'll scroll on down and locate that 50943 report DLL right there, because that's, of course, the Analytical Results 2 report. And I'll select Open. And then we get our report publisher. We get a nice intro showing us what the report is. If the existing report section is populated, then you know that the report has previously been published to the database. You can see essentially what you're ultimately going to be publishing in this new report section. And then on this incoming report section, you can see potentially what could be delivered based on that DLL information. So if I maximize my parameter set, you can see that I have quite a bit of choices here, and a couple of them have an alternate color here. So the red parameters that are listed here indicate that we have instances where there is a mismatch between what's coming in from our incoming report and then what's already stored in our database. So let's check those out. So if I click on ND multiplier, I can see that in the incoming parameter, that is actually visible by default. But in the existing parameter, meaning how it has been set up in the current published version of this report, it's actually not visible. Okay, in this case, the only difference between the existing report as well as the incoming parameter is just the parameter's visibility. So basically what that means is if I were to look at this report in our interface, I would be able to tell whether or not our users would have access to it and to be able to see it, right? So in this case, maybe I want to keep that report non-detect multiplier as invisible. I've already got a default value set in that particular parameter for 1. I'm happy with that. Maybe there's no need for there to be any difference for our various projects. So instead of keeping that yes as a visible parameter for the incoming parameter, I'm going to go ahead and click that little arrow that points to the right to tuck that no into our expected information to be published. Okay. The other field that I see that has a difference here is that extra select field, which we'll talk about a little bit later. In this case, again, the only difference between the incoming parameter and the existing parameter in the database is the parameter visibility. And again, since we're going to be talking about it, it's probably not a bad idea to have that visible. So I'll go ahead and again, hit that arrow to push that right into the new parameter section. Additionally, you can actually, write over this. And if I wanted to switch this back to no, I could either type N or I could click my arrow over there. Okay. So once I've made those changes and I'm satisfied with reviewing all of the various options here, I can go through and finally publish that report. Another thing to note is this is probably the easiest way to go through and toggle on and off visibility and set default values in terms of user interface. I'll talk a little bit later about how you can manage this information in our ST report parameter table, but in terms of easy to view and that kind of thing, I think that the report publisher is definitely the best interface to do that in. So I'll go ahead and come on up to the save button here. And once I click that save button, it will give me a notice saying, are you sure you want to store the report assembly in the database? So basically it's saying, you're about to publish this report. Did you mean to? And I sure did. So I'll say yes. Then the next thing that I'm going to do is, or then it'll say it was successful. And I'll say, okay, great. But perhaps there is a circumstance where I have a couple of different needs for a different analytical results to report. You can certainly fine tune your report so they might be project specific or maybe analyte specific, depending on if you're using, reporting on dioxins and furans versus a different kind of data set. If that's a need that you have, you can use this copy selected report button. And what that will do is essentially create a copy of that report. You can adjust both the title of the report as well as any of the parameters again. It won't make any changes to the analytical results 2 report that we've just published. It'll just create an additional copy with whatever the additional fine tunes are that are in there. Okay. So once I've published that report, I can go ahead and close my report publisher. I need to go into my reports window and refresh. And it'll take a second. There we go. Bounced at me for a second so I can tell that it's refreshed. And so now that report that I have published has been updated. Although, to be honest, I just republished the same information, so I don't have to close this analytical results 2 guy right here. Okay. So that's the first part of what I wanted to talk about here. The next thing that I wanted to talk about is some alternate date formats that are available to us. And this is actually available in our tabular report interface. So basically, once you've run the report, you go through, pick your target parameters, you run the report, and then by default, you'll have in the analytical results 2 report your sample underscore date, your sample date, and your sample time fields. Okay, of course I said those fast because there's no underscore. And if you wanted to add some additional date format options there, all you have to do is right click on that sample underscore date field, and then you can select an alternate date format from that dropdown. Additionally, if whatever format or separator characters or what have you are not available to you just in some of those default values, you can free type in that field as well. And it follows that the Microsoft date formatting guidelines. I have those listed here on screen. These are the ones that EQuIS will honor. So you can, give January 3rd listed as 3 or 03, depending on if you select DD or D in terms of our date. You can abbreviate your days of the week to Tuesday or 2. You can list out your months all the way through, or you can just identify them as a number. A handy one here that certainly comes into play in terms of a lot of ERSA scheduling is the week number. So you can include the week number in your date. Additionally, something that I love for crosstab report organization, you can add a quarter format. So for whatever the date falls in, it would indicate Q1, for example. You can also, of course, append the year on there, so it's not just a bunch of Q1s. You can actually, tell the difference between those guys. But there are a lot of different ways that that you can present the date, and lots of different ways that they can be, applied ultimately either in crosstabs or, just your standard report outputs. The one thing that I want to point out is that the capitalization of the characters is important, particularly with the letter M. Capital M indicates month, whereas lowercase m indicates minute. The examples I have in these alternate date formats here are just day, month, year, and then of course quarter and week. But there's also the opportunity to change your hour, minute, second formatting as well. Okay, so let's see that in action. I'll go ahead and pull up a saved user report here. I'll just pick on depth range just because it gives us a nice data set to look at. And I'll run that report. It takes a second because I do have an extra select behind there. It has to toss together some information. But right here on screen in the middle here, we've got our sample date, and our sample time fields, okay? So the sample date field is the one where you would want to right click and then select date column. And then I can change that format based on all of these choices. So for example, if I wanted to add that quarter, like I mentioned, once I make that selection, it populates that field, and then I just hit the enter key, and then it'll stick a new column right there in that report display, okay? I also want to note that it doesn't just have to be related to sample date field. Any of the fields that are actually a date time field in the report output can have this additional functionality applied as well. But let's say, for example, I want to do something crazy. I want to free type something. Let's see, maybe I want to go week, quarter, year, for whatever reason. I know that's kind of unusual, but why not? And then I hit enter. You'll see that we get week, quarter, year. Oh, that's maybe not the best one. In this case, I should have done a capital Q, so it doesn't know what to do with that. So it just repeated that week information. Okay, let's maybe start with something like we've got our maybe we're looking at sorting a particular crosstab set of data, and we want to sort by year, month, day. We can go year, month, and then day. And again, that allows us to then sort in ascending or descending order, depending on what our preference is. So it's a really handy way to add this information into the tabular report interface easily. The other thing I want to note that's really nice about this is if you choose to add any of those different style date time formats to your crosstab interface, EQuIS will honor that. It will be able to tell in the background what the appropriate date time format is, even if the source report doesn't have that field in there. That's not necessarily true of all of the other functionalities we're going to talk about, but that is one nice handy thing. You can throw the quarter separator if you want to do a group by, for example, in your crosstab, and it will absolutely honor that regardless of whether that information is included in your source report the next time you apply that crosstab. Okay. All right. So the next thing I want to talk about is really my favorite thing in the content that we're talking about today, and that's extra selects. So if you're unfamiliar with extra selects, I'll give you a little bit of background. Essentially what it does is add information to the select clause of the SQL statement behind the report, but it allows you to supplement the report output with a combination of result or formatted result fields or all kinds of different things. So I'll talk about a couple of different options here. These are things that I've either seen in cases that people have sent in with questions or conversations on the product or on both the product advisory forum as well as the community center forum. You know, it's really neat to see how folks have been able to use the extra selects to augment their existing reports. So the first thing I want to talk about here is the extra select, this first one here with the chemical name with the CAS number as long analyte. Okay, so maybe you want to be able to see both your analyte name and the CAS number there just for informational purposes. In this case, we cast the CAS number just in case, just for clarity's sake. We added some brackets here with the quotes, single quotes around those brackets and space. And we essentially said, I want to see the chemical name and the CAS number as long analyte. So what it will do is look to the report, find the chemical name field, find the CAS_RN field, and then concatenate those into the long analyte field. It's a brand new field that it'll create, okay? Another thing that I've heard people request is combining your analyte and a fraction. So in this example, we've got sodium plus total, so we've got total sodium. In this case, the ultimate field that it's going to be added to has brackets around it, and that's because there are spaces in there. If you're going to have a nicely formatted output format, like analyte by fraction, for example, you'll need to make sure you put that in brackets. Whereas you note long analyte doesn't require brackets because it's all one word just separated by that underscore, okay? And then one other example here, maybe you don't care so much about fraction for your analyte, but you definitely want to see fraction definition for your analytic method. You can combine those as well. In this case, I called that fraction method. Okay, really straightforward. All of this information goes into the extra selects field. I'll show you where that is in a second, don't worry. And it allows you to just add an additional column to your report so that you can, you know, add that information to your, whatever your ultimate output might be. The next type of extra selects that we're going to talk about are replacement values. This is actually a hot topic that came up on the Community Center Forum a couple of days ago, I think. And the conversation was about a requirement in RT qualifier. It's only a 2-character field length limitation. And for dioxins, you need to have the 4-character EMPC as one qualifier with the dioxins analysis. And so what some folks have been able to do is create basically a placeholder fake qualifier for the EMPC. And then using the extra selects, you just create this nice replace statement. And what it will do is it will replace any of the lab qualifiers with that pretend qualifier. In this case, I made it an exclamation point to be ridiculous. And then I would replace that with the EMPC. And then again, that creates a new field called full qualifier. The best part about that is the only thing it's going to change, as you see in this screenshot, is that exclamation point. All of the other lab qualifiers that are going to be in that circumstance stay exactly the same. Okay, so that's one way to get around little limitation that exists in that RT qualifier field length restriction. Okay, another option is to maybe you have field length limitation in the names of your method analyte groups, and you know perk daughters, you know what that is, but because you have to kind of abbreviate and give as much information with as few characters as possible, maybe it isn't quite as beautiful a title for a method analyte group as you would like to see. Just to be ridiculous, I made a relatively long replaced preferred method name here because SW8260B tetrachloroethylene daughter product is significantly longer than the method analyte group code field limitation. So you can see there that we actually get around the field length limitation by using the extra select. So again, what I did is said replace my method analyte group code of perk daughters with this gargantuanly long new preferred method name, and go ahead and save that in my preferred method name field that I'm creating fresh. Okay. That is, there's actually a caveat to that example. In order to use that, you need to also make sure that you use the additional fields parameter, which I'll show you in a second, to add the RT-methanol group, method analyte group code field to the report in order for that to work correctly. Okay. So the last extra select functionality here is the complex application. I really like this one because this is like the really jazzy one that I like to point to the most in terms of extra selects, because it allows you to take 3 fields in this case, plus some formatting, and create a field in this case called depth range. So we're taking our start depth and our end depth, and then our depth units, and smashing them all together into one column instead of having 3 separate columns. It makes it much prettier when you're looking at a report. It's much easier to see. But in this case, the reason why this is a more complex application is we're using a case statement to make sure that we are formatting it correctly in the event we either don't have a start depth, or we don't have an end depth, or we don't have any data at all. Okay. Additionally, we have to cast the start and end depth as varchar because it is a numeric field. I think that was new in version 6.5. Although it might have been 6.4, I can't remember. Sometime relatively recently, the depth unit changed over to a numeric code. So if previously you had a much simpler extra select statement for creating a depth range and it hasn't been working for you, this is probably why. So I recognize that's a lot of text on screen. So just to give a better understanding of what that looks like, essentially I've plucked out the very end of that statement. So I'm saying essentially cast the start depth as varchar 20 plus this space dash space, and then add the end depth, and then add a space, and then add the depth unit. And then I want you to call that depth range in my extra selects. Okay. And you can kind of see here our start depth and depth. We've got our sort of color coding carrying us along through that. Okay. So that would be how you can apply those extra selects. If you have been madly making notes in a notebook, I want to point you to the materials of this particular session. In the handout section, you can actually download a copy of these extra selects. There's a little bit of limitation in the kinds of file types that GoToWebinar allows, so it happens to be a document. So if there's some wacky formatting that happened in the copy-paste process and you want to just see the text file, we'll go ahead and include that with the recording distribution as well. Okay. So I'll go ahead and back out of the presentation once more so that we can take a look at how we would apply those extra selects. So there's actually 2 ways we can do it. We can either do it in our analytical results report right there in our extra selects field, which I have populated right here with that start end depth example that I told you at the very end of that, which is really handy. But you might decide, look, I want to make sure this is in there all the time. My users are not necessarily so savvy that they are going to be able to add an extra select statement correctly without any sort of syntax errors. You will, of course, get an error if you run the report without the correct information. And because of that, you might say, I want to be able to make this a default value that's hidden. Easy enough. In that case, you actually will come to your ST report parameter table, and you'll need to using ST report decide which is the analytical results report that you need to make that change for. So in this case, this last one in the list here is that analytical results 2 report that I just published. So I'll go ahead and copy that report ID and filter on that in my ST report parameter table rather. And I also like to sort on my parameter order so that it's in the same order that I'm accustomed to seeing it in my report output, my parameter output rather. And then since extra select is way at the bottom, I can just scroll on down to find that. Okay, so here's the extra select option 4 from the bottom there. So there, in this case, there's no default value. I could certainly change that by copying and pasting in any of those select statements that are in that example that I've got in the handouts. So if I wanted to take that start depth, end depth example as I was talking about, I can copy that and then paste that right here into that default value field. And then I maybe change my visibility from yes to no. And then once I save that, then and refresh, of course, the report, it will hide that particular field I'll still get my depth range field that's created by that select statement, but I don't have to worry about somebody accidentally adding a character or screwing it up because it's visible. Okay. That being said, I'll actually just run this as it is here in the report output. So I'm going to start with that depth range that we talked about last. Go ahead and run that. The thing to remember is because we're adding an additional component to the select statement in the report, it might take a little bit longer to run than if you didn't have that. And that extra select field will end up being added to the very end of our report output. So in this case, I've got my depth range right there. Okay, pretty handy. Okay, for fun, let's go back and try out that Perk Daughters example that we talked about with the crazy long name. Notice you have to have that additional fields populated for their RT method analyte group code field. If you don't, and you run the report, you'll get an error saying invalid column name because this isn't included in the report output by default. Okay, so if I add that guy back in, just reselect that parameter set by making that selection in our extra fields parameter. Once I run that again, this is a much larger data set, so it takes a little bit longer to run. So once I run that, I can scroll on all the way to the end. Sorry about the scroll delay. And we can see that we've got our preferred method name of that long daughter product example. And if I scroll on through, at some point, I think I'll reach a data set. Yep, so here we have nasty VOCs. I didn't do a replacement. I probably should, because nasty VOCs is probably not what I want to have out on my report output ultimately. So I might just add an additional exactly the same kind of statement as I did previously, separated by a comma, and say replace nasty VOCs with whatever my new title would be, and then everything would be A-okay. Okay. So then the last one that I wanted to show you is that qualifier that I talked about. So in this case, I've got just my dioxin analyte here, and I've got that extra select of replacing the lab qualifier of the exclamation point with EMPC, and I'm creating a new full qualifier field. So if I run that report, scroll on all the way to the end once more, I can see I've got my full qualifier. Let me actually hide some of the blank columns here. So I've got my full qualifier at the furthest extent, and if you follow the bouncing mouse all the way to the lab qualifiers field, you can see that our exclamation point was replaced, but the EQualifier stayed intact over in that full qualifier field. Okay, so that's really handy in circumstances like that. All right. The last thing that I wanted to talk about then is the additional fields functionality. In the interest of time and complexity, I'm not actually going to give a lot of detail about the additional fields, but I did want to tell you that it can be very handy, not just to add extra output to your report, like we saw with adding that method analyte group code to our report output, but additionally, this is so stinking cool. I'm really happy to learn this. You can amplify existing output with some remaps. This would require you to set up your RT remap and RT remap detail tables, but essentially you can add some additional code to the source code section of the SD report parameter table, or data source rather, and it will essentially point the report to look at your particular remap set and do all kinds of remaps using that information. So if, for example, you have a project that reports both to the state of New York as well as, or maybe you have two projects, one that reports to the state of New York and one that reports to EPA Region 2, they might have disparate reference values. You might have chosen one set of reference values over the other. If you have a set of remaps that are established in your database, you can reference those in that data source field, and it will apply those remaps when it runs the report. This will allow you to actually apply remaps to the analytical results 2 report, which is something you can't do in the tabular interface. That grid is frozen. You can't actually edit anything in that grid. So that sort of gets around that problem as well. So if you want more information on that, we do have a good online documentation article with details on how you would actually set that up, including the data source information. So since I mentioned the data source bit, I ought to show you that part of the ST report parameter section as well. And this is where you can add additional information. So for that extra fields or additional fields, as it's called by the caption, you can see that we've got quite the data source piece of information there, but you can add additional fields there. You can also add that remap functionality as well right in there using that link that I included there on screen. Okay. So with that, I guess my next question is, what will you use? Which part of that is your most favorite? So I'll go ahead and take a look at the questions pane. I see that there are several flashing here. So I've got a question from Peter asking, can you use multiple extra selects in one query so you can replace qualifiers and do depths at the same time? Great question, Peter. Absolutely, you can. All you have to do is separate those guys with a comma. So it's easier to do, in my opinion, actually in ST report parameter and your default value, although you can certainly do it in the parameter section itself. So if I go on over to that extra selects, if I wanted to add the depth range, I'll just add a comma. And here's going to be the real test of my copy and paste skills, right? So let's see if I copied that correctly. Aha. And then if I run it, of course, I don't think there's depth range data for this data set, but that's neither here nor there. But yeah, so it would allow you to add that depth range information there if I had depth data there. Mary asks, how do we know which tables and views are available in extra selects? That's a good question. I think that it's just limited to the actual output in terms of the fields that are in the tabular report, but I'll have to find out. There might be additional things. Oh, or are you asking, Mary, specifically like for different reports and that kind of thing? I know that extra selects is available both in the Analytical Results 2 report as well as the Action Level Exceedance 2. I'm not sure if it's really in other areas as well. So I'll find out both of those because I'm not sure which one of those your questions are applicable. I see Sarah asks, is it possible to have more than one extra select? Yep, same question as Peter had. Yes, it definitely is. Like I said, with this data set example, we can't really see that, unfortunately. This is a made-up data set, so I could demonstrate that qualifier replacement, but you can certainly do both of those at the same time. And then Ping asks, which way is preferred to make the parameter changed with a report, using the report publisher or with the ST report parameter table? It's kind of up to you. I like to use the report publisher because it's a little bit easier for me to see all of the information in there. Although to be fair, I usually will craft my SQL statement in SQL to make sure I don't have any glaring errors because it checks it for me, of course. And then I'll paste it into the target field. I think it's easier to see in the report publisher, but you can certainly make the changes in your ST report parameter table as well. So that can be pretty handy. Either way, it's kind of up to you which one you prefer. So that's a good question. Oh, I just remembered there was one other particular field that I wanted to show all of you. This is probably not, this is another field that's hidden by default. This is the individual facilities locations parameter. And this was actually created based on a client request a couple of versions ago. Maybe not so applicable in EQuIS Professional, but definitely really handy in EQuIS Enterprise, particularly if you're trying to run a report across multiple facilities, if you're doing like a regional report or something like that. The request was to not only have the sysloc code and the location name information, but also include the facility code and facility name. So since I'm logged into Professional to only a single facility, all I see is Springfield. But for those projects where you basically have relatively generic names, like monitoring well 1 or that kind of thing, this particular parameter, which again is hidden by default, allows you to see, which monitoring well might be associated with each facility. So maybe you would choose to publish a second version of the Analytical Results 2 report and give it a cross-facility name, perhaps, so that you know that that's the particular report that you'd be able to see that differentiation. So that's pretty handy as well. Okay. Also in this office hour version, I went through and hid a bunch of fields so that you can see that you can shrink down the number of parameters that are visible to your users. So if you know, like always, you're going to have a particular, excuse me, set of configurations, whether that is your non-detect multiplier or things like that, or if you know that you're never going to need to know your column number in your report output, you can hide those or set your default value and hide them, and then just give the shorter view for your users to see so that they don't have to scroll through so many parameters in making their selections. And I think that the fewer choices they have, the less decision fatigue they might run into. So that can be really handy as well. So I want to go ahead and plug some more information. The add parameter selection is in our online documentation. That article actually is pretty nice. It does have some example extra selects and can give you some additional information, which is pretty handy. There's, in fact, an example that's in the material that I have in that handouts that allows you to add an additional date time format using extra selects. So you don't even have to use that date time trick I showed you in the tabular report. Additionally, there have been a couple of really good conversations on the community forum about using and applying extra selects. If all of you are interested, we can certainly maybe use the office hour post on the community center to share all of our favorites. I can maybe add the items that I've talked about today as well, so that we'll have those available there. But I'm sure that there are tons more ways that you can apply this that I haven't talked about, just because it's a really handy tool, and I probably don't have as much imagination in the application as all of you who work with this data on a regular basis. So I want to thank all of you for your attention and for your questions today. I'll find out answers to those your questions, Mary, because I'm not sure what the answer is there. But if you do have any questions in follow-up to this, if you've got future topic suggestions, if you want to present an office hour, or if you'd like to sign up for future office hours, you can email us at officehours@earthsoft.com. And I really appreciate your attention, and have a wonderful day, everybody.